During World War II, he lived through 3 concentration camps and he was lucky to come out alive. Today, he's 88 and he still goes to schools to tell children about his life, but as he's getting older, he's able to do it less and less, and that's why I'm here today, to speak on his behalf and as a witness for the survivors and the murdered of the Holocaust. I'm his youngest child. I have 2 older brothers and 3 sons of my own. We're just a normal, regular family like all of you. Now, as most of you probably know, 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. They were murdered simply for being born Jewish. Now, I know it's really, really hard to get your head around that number, but just try to help you imagine. Think of Nottingham, Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester, all those towns being completely wiped out. Well, that's 4.5 million. So if you add in the whole of Northern Ireland, you kind of get the scale that we're talking about. But that's why I've always felt it's important to know the individual stories. So I would like to talk to you about my father and his life. Dad was born in Poland in a large town called Piotrków-Trybunalski, and before the war it had a population of 55,000 people, of which 15,000 were Jews. And here's a photo. The one at the bottom was taken on a family trip back in 2007, and the one at the top was pre-war. So as you can see, it was quite a modern, vibrant, bustling town. Well, Dad was born on the 21st of November 1929, and he lived with his mother, father, and little sister Gita, who was 2 years younger. His father, Laser, was a tailor, and his mother, Tamar, sold milk to make ends meet because they were very poor. He was very close to his mother, and he would sometimes help her carry the heavy pails of milks on her round. So they were so poor that this is a photo of where they lived, and each green door on the left was just the entrance to an apartment, which was 1 room. The family ate, slept there. There was no separate kitchen, no separate bedrooms, definitely no separate bathrooms. In fact, the door you can see on the right, that's the one outside toilet for all those apartments. But his grandparents, aunts, uncles and cousins all lived in the same building. Dad never knew anything better, and so he was very happy. In the morning, he went to a local school where all the children spoke Polish, but because his family were religious Orthodox Jews, in the afternoon, he went to a Jewish school for religious studies where he spoke Yiddish, which is a German-based Jewish language that was spoken across Eastern Europe at the time, and he'd also speak Yiddish at home with his family. And this is a photo of how I imagine Dad may have looked at his Jewish school, but unfortunately we don't have any photos of his family or any possessions, as everything was taken away from them. So until 1939, my father had a normal, happy childhood. He used to play with his friends, go to school and help his parents at home, and life was pretty good in his small, close-knit community. Then on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and my dad was just 9 years old. And it wasn't long before Nazi soldiers were marching on the streets of Piotrków. And here's a photo. Well, in the very beginning, Dad said he doesn't remember any dramatic changes. Soldiers would go into shops, even if they were Jewish-owned. But after only a few weeks, an announcement was made that every Jew in the town was ordered to wear a yellow star with the word Jew on it. It didn't matter how old you were, you had to wear it at all times, otherwise you would be shot. And here's a photo with the word Judah, which is German for Jew. And so then all the Jewish shops had to display a yellow star in their window, so non-Jewish people became too scared to shop there. There was anti-Jewish legislation, and life became much harder for the community, as more and more of their rights were taken away and restrictions put on them. My father wasn't even allowed to go to school anymore, and his formal education came to an abrupt halt at the age of 10. How would you feel about that? It wasn't a week or a month or a fun holiday at home with his family. It was just he was never allowed to go to school again, purely because he'd been born Jewish. So it wasn't long before the Nazis then forced all the Jews to move to ghettos, which are a confined part of town where all Jews are forced to live. And in fact, his town, Piotrków, became the first established ghetto in Poland. And here's a photo of people being ushered into a ghetto. Imagine if you were forced to leave your home and go and live in another part of town. And so Piotrkov's population of 15,000 Jews were suddenly forced to live in one small area in the poor part of town. Well, the room that Dad and his family lived happened to be in the ghetto area, but many other families had to leave their homes with very short notice and very few possessions. The soldiers would turn up at your door and you had to leave with just what you could carry, and you had to find somewhere, anywhere, to live within the ghetto. My father remembers the Nazis used to patrol the ghetto with their Alsatian dogs, and that was very frightening. The guards would order the dogs to attack the Jews just for fun, with the command, "Get the Jew," and they would laugh about it. He told me about a particular episode when the Nazis rounded up some 20 people who were doctors, lawyers, community leaders, and shot them outside the town hall, purely in order to scare the community and ensure that they would obey the Nazis. Whilst in the ghetto there was rationing. There wasn't much food to buy anyway, and as people struggled to work because of the restrictions, there wasn't very much money to spend. Well, soon the conditions in the ghetto were getting even worse. The Nazis had been rounding up Jews from the surrounding villages and towns and forcing them into the ghettos. So now there were 25,000 Jews living in that small area. There was less and less food and more people. Families were just living on the streets. There was terrible hunger by now, and diseases were spreading. He remembers that people were now dying of starvation, and there were dead bodies every day on the streets, as you can see. So my father helped the family by taking what little money they had and buying food from outside the ghetto and smuggling it in. He sold half of it, and he'd keep half for the family to eat. In the beginning, if the Nazis caught anyone smuggling, they would beat them. But it wasn't too long before they started to shoot them. His mother then asked him to stop, as she was scared for him. After all, he was still just a little boy, only 11 years old. And as she always said to him, living is the most important thing, and she didn't want anything bad to happen to him. Food was running out, they didn't have much money, and life was very difficult. And Dad was still worried about how to support his family. He felt responsible for them, even though he was still so young. There was a large glass factory in town called Hortensia that employed a lot of people, and at that time they still paid Jews a small wage. He decided to apply for a job there, but he was turned away, as when asked how old he was, he told them, 11. But you had to be at least 12 to work there. He was determined, though, and he went back the following day. Luckily, it wasn't the same woman on reception, and this time he gave his age as 12. He was very lucky. He got the job, and so again he was able to help his family so that they didn't starve. And if you go to the next photo, here, this is the work pages of the factory, and you can see highlighted is my father, Spiro, and then his birth year, 21st November 1928. He had to change it to make himself a year older. So I know that's not much, it's just a picture of a photocopy from a book, but when we got that, it was very emotional for all of us because it was the first time we'd ever had anything that connected my dad to his childhood. So you're probably wondering what job an 11-year-old might have in a glass factory. And believe it or not, my father had to shape molten hot glass into medicine bottles for the Nazi soldiers. So life carried on. It was very hard, but at least the family were together. Then one day, early in the morning in September 1942, a curfew was imposed and no one was allowed to go outside. But there was no food at home, so Dad decided to take a risk. He ran out to the building opposite, which happened to be a bakery, and he took some bread. If he'd been seen, he would have been shot, but at least his family ate that day. Later in the afternoon, it was announced that anyone with a work permit for the glass factory should go and meet outside the synagogue in town. Well, Dad was the only one of his family with a work permit and didn't want to leave. His mother argued with him that he had to go, and he kept refusing. Remember, he'd always been especially close with her. He was hugging on to her, and eventually she had to physically unwrap his arms from around her waist and push him out the house. And the last words she said to him were, "Hopefully, let one of us survive." She must have had a premonition of what would happen. My father told me how he cried when he left. Remember, he was still only 12 years old, and he couldn't understand how his own mother could do this to him. Well, little did he know. Little did he know that this would be the last time he would ever see his mother, his father, his little sister Gita, or any of the family. And it was only years later that he understood what she had meant, and that she'd done this as she loved him and wanted to give him a chance of survival. He told me how he cried all the way to the synagogue, convinced he would be shot, as by then he was the only person on the street. The SS then moved the factory workers to a smaller ghetto by the outskirts of town, where they were now forced to work as prisoners with no pay and very little food. Just 3 days later, all the remaining Jews in the original ghetto, so those not working in the factory, were rounded up, put on cattle trucks, like you can see here, and sent to Treblinka. Now, Treblinka was an extermination camp. You were gassed on arrival. I think the average lifespan there was 45 minutes. His whole family were included in these roundups, and Dad often wonders how his family, especially his mother and little sister, felt in their final moments. Were they together? Did they suffer terribly? And this is something that always haunts him. My father told me how he received a note from his mother that she had written whilst being transported. When the cattle trucks passed near the factory, people would throw notes out of the small slats, and amazingly, her note found its way to my dad. And in it, she wrote again how much she loved him, and again how she hoped that someone in the family would survive. Well, that someone is my dad, Harry. He's the only survivor of his entire extended family: parents, sister, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. But back to Piotrków. One day when my dad was returning from work at the glass factory with a group of other workers, they were rounded up and taken to the synagogue. And that's a picture of the synagogue. He was kept there for 3 days with no food, no water, and no sanitation. They were being held there until 500 people had been rounded up, as basically what happened when the main ghetto had been liquidated, some people hid themselves in the smaller ghetto, but this was only meant to be for the factory workers. So there were now too many people, and the Nazis wanted to get rid of them. The Nazis declared that anyone with the correct papers, without the correct papers, would be given permission to stay officially if they handed themselves in. Well, 300 Jews did this, but of course they weren't allowed to stay. Instead, they were held captive in the synagogue. And the Nazis then didn't care so much about who was in there, just the numbers. So they rounded up anybody on the streets until the 500 had been made up. The synagogue was guarded by Ukrainian soldiers, and my father told me they would take pot shots through the windows just for fun to see if they could shoot anyone. And this is a picture. This was at the back of the synagogue wall. You can see the bullet holes. It's actually still there. The synagogue is now turned into a library, and that painting, that wall's still there. It's just covered up with a curtain. Well, eventually the foreman from the glass factory came with a list of names of workers he needed to be released, and luckily Dad's name was on the list. Dad always remembers a man being called for release. He stepped forward carrying a small child in his arms. He was told that he could go, but the child had to stay. And in that split second, the man had to decide whether to stay and face certain death or go and leave the child behind. Well, he chose to stay, and the next day everyone in the synagogue was taken to the forest and shot. By the end of 1944, the Russians were advancing, so the Nazis decided to move the prisoners, including my father, to a camp called Czestochowa. And that's just a factory in the camp. Here, things started to get even worse for him. Dad was put to work in the ammunition factory. He says it was freezing cold, and they were given only very, very small food rations, but he wasn't there for long. The Russians were continuing their advance, so the Nazis moved the prisoners again. Their train left Czestochowa just a few hours before the Russians arrived. They were then taken to another camp called Buchenwald. This was a large holding camp where prisoners were processed for forced labour. In Buchenwald, my father told me how he was forced to strip. He was disinfected, his head was shaved, and he was given the striped prison uniform. They were taken to the showers, and by this time they had heard rumours of gas chambers. They were all nervous, but thankfully it was just a shower this time. His own clothes and possessions were taken away from him, and this included the treasured note his mother had written on her way to Treblinka. And it was here in Buchenwald that even his name was taken away, and he was given just a number, 116927. And as you can see, his registration card with his number on the top right. Next photo. At this time, Dad wasn't given work to do, but every day there was appel, roll call, and the prisoners were forced to stand for hours on end in the freezing cold for no real purpose other than to further degrade them, and they could smell the crematorium from where they were standing. So here's a picture of roll call. Now, you all know how cold it's been recently. It's even colder in Poland. They only had thin pyjamas and they just had to stand literally all day. And as you can see, the man on the right, second in the front, he's having difficulty, but the two men either side are helping him to stand up. You just had to stand all day long. Conditions were bad and lice spread very quickly among the prisoners. Here there was very little food for them, but my father said at least he had no heavy work to do. So these are the bunks at Buchenwald, and you can see they're 4 high. Now, Dad always used to say it was important to get the top bunk, as basically people would be too exhausted or ill to get out of bed in the night for the toilet, so they would urinate, vomit, or even worse, where they were. And as you can see, there are no mattresses, they just slept on wooden slats, so everything would drip through, so those on the lower bunks had to endure this further degradation. After about 2 weeks, my father was then sent with a group of 30 or so prisoners to another camp called Remsdorf. Dad always says that this was the worst camp he was ever in. The work here was very physical, and the food rations even less than before. When they arrived, they were given a potato each. It wasn't clean like the ones we get in supermarkets today. It was muddy from the earth. Dad told us they peeled the potato and dropped the dirty peelings on the muddy floor. Well, suddenly, the other inmates jumped on the ground to eat these dirty scraps. He couldn't believe it, that people could be that starving. He also said he wasn't there for long before he was doing the same. Every morning in the washroom, there were dead bodies. People just had no more energy to live. Sometimes they died and not eaten their bread rations, so Dad would take the bread to eat. I remember him saying how terrible it was that they were by now all so dehumanized. They didn't feel anything at the sight of a dead body, but just thought how he felt it was his lucky day that he'd managed to get some extra bread. Some of his work here included rebuilding a bombed chemical factory, and this involved having to carry very heavy electrical cables on their shoulders from one place to another. Here's a picture of workers there. But one day, 2 guards picked some boys to go and mend a fence, which was by an area where American prisoners of war were being held, obviously in better conditions than the Jews. At the back of their barracks was a trough where they'd put all their leftover food and rotting vegetable peelings for the pigs to eat. Dad decided to take a chance. He jumped over the small fence, scooped up some of this rotting food and put it in his pockets. Imagine being so desperate to risk your life to eat that. As he made his way back, he saw that one of the Nazis had spotted him. He'd taken his rifle off his shoulder and was taking aim. That was it. Dad was convinced he'd be shot. But instead, the second Nazi came up and began to beat Dad in the face with the butt of his rifle. He didn't hit him once, but he carried on hitting him. Dad was knocked unconscious, and both his front teeth were knocked out. When he woke up, he was in a lot of pain and had blood pouring down his face, but he hurried back to work. And to this day, Dad isn't sure if the second Nazi was vicious to have beaten him so hard, or in his way, was he being kind to Dad? At least he wasn't shot dead. By the end of March 1945, the Allies were advancing and the Nazis decided to evacuate the camp. The prisoners were put on open freight trains, but after only a few miles, the railway was bombed and the Nazis forced the prisoners to walk. They marched for many days. Dad doesn't remember exactly how long it took, but he thinks it was about 2 or 3 weeks. And here's a photo of prisoners marching. They would stop off in villages and stay in a stable, but most of these were too small to accommodate the 3,000 prisoners who were marching. And in the night, people would be squashed on top of you, their arms and legs on your chest, and because you were so weak, you could suffocate. Well, Dad was very careful that this should never happen to him, so he always stayed by the side of the walls, so no one ended up on top of him. In the morning, there would be dead bodies on the floor, but they just left them behind and continued with their march. Occasionally, the prisoners were given a boiled potato and a hot drink, but if the farmer didn't have the provisions, then they got nothing. On that march, they were in groups of 200 to 300, so it was a very long line, and the only rule was that you had to keep going. So you could sit down until the end of the line was near you, but then you had to get up and start walking again. There were SS men at the back of the line, and if you couldn't get up to walk because you were too exhausted, they would simply shoot you. Dad said that on a few occasions he was simply too exhausted, and the thought of, well, at least it will be quick and I won't have to endure this anymore, definitely crossed his mind. But as the Nazi guard cocked his gun and shot the person next to Dad, somehow, thankfully, he always managed to find the strength to get up again. Well, this terrible journey came to be known as the Death March, and out of 3,000 prisoners who started from Remsdorf, there were only less than 300 who survived. That's 2,700 prisoners killed through sheer exhaustion or starvation. Now, on one occasion on the march, there were Allied planes flying over the group, so they were ordered to lay down in the fields and hide. Well, as luck would have it, Dad noticed 2 turnips in the field. He took a chance, made a dash over to them, dug them up and rejoined the group. Well, one of the boys noticed what he'd done, and he went and asked for a piece. Dad didn't know him. He told him no. And the other boys said, basically, if you don't give me any, I'm going to let the other boys know what you've got. And what would have happened is they'd jump on Dad to get the food, and ultimately Dad wouldn't have survived. So Dad relented and he gave him a piece. This other boy came back a second time. Dad gave him some more. And on the third occasion, Dad said no more. Thankfully, he left him alone. Well, he survived, and so did my dad. They became lifelong friends. They were both called Harry. They both married girls called Pauline, and they were business partners for many years. And in fact, this room that we're sitting in here now is named after Harry Balsam-Shaw, and that's the other Harry that we're talking about. The death march eventually ended when they arrived at Theresienstadt. By this time, Dad was seriously ill with dysentery, typhus, and severe dehydration. He doesn't remember actually walking in there, just that he woke up and someone told him that the war was over and that they'd been liberated by the Russians on the 8th of May, 1945. And there's a photo of prisoners at liberation. So Dad knew they were free, but he didn't really know what that meant for him or what he was going to do now. He remembers that the Russians were appalled at what they saw and gave the Jewish prisoners freedom to do what they wanted to the captured Nazis. But Dad, who was by now 15, says he doesn't remember anyone wanting revenge. They were just grateful to have survived. He just took chocolate and cigarettes from the soldiers and then was so ill from eating chocolate after surviving for so long on such meagre rationings. I remember he told me how a boy he was with called Izzy asked a Nazi for his tobacco pouch. The Nazi pleaded with Izzy to let him keep it as he was addicted to cigarettes. He offered him food and money instead, but Izzy insisted he wanted the tobacco pouch. Eventually, the Nazi was made to hand it over by the Russian soldier guarding him, and when he opened it back in his barracks, he discovered it was filled with diamonds. Izzy couldn't believe his luck, and he told everyone what had happened and that he'd hidden it under his mattress. So, needless to say, the next morning the diamonds had disappeared. After the war, a British Jewish charity called World Jewish Relief negotiated with the British government to bring 1,000 children from the camps to the UK. Well, at first the government said no, but eventually they agreed as long as the children were 15 or under, orphaned, and survivors of the concentration camps. The charity also had to agree to finance the children so that they wouldn't be a financial burden on the state. And although they had permission for 1,000 children, they only managed to find 732 at that time, one of whom was my dad. They were then always referred to as the boys, even though there were about 80 girls among them, and even when they were well into their 80s. And here's a photo of them in Prague just before coming to England. And the historian Sir Martin Gilbert wrote a book about this remarkable group of child survivors called simply The Boys: Triumph Over Adversity. And if anyone's interested, it really is a good read. It's basically the history of the Second World War, but it's interlaced with personal memoirs of the boys. Dad came to England on the first transport to Carlisle Airport, and from there they were taken to Windermere. And there, highlighted by the blue arrow, that's a picture of my dad landing in England for the first time. And the next one. And this is him as a young man in the UK. As you can see, they had absolutely nothing to their name, not even a pair of shoes. So all the clothes, they were all donated by charity, but they didn't care. They were just lucky that they were alive. And as you can see, they're beginning to put on a bit of weight now as well. Well, Dad's memory of this time in England was that it was very serene and quiet. The World Jewish Relief Charity sent teachers and volunteers to help teach the boys English and integrate them back into society. Remember, they'd been torn from their families, and from the ages of 10 to 15 years, they'd seen the worst things and horrors that people can do to each other. Dad always said that the charity showed them that people can be kind and help them adjust back to normal life. He remembers that the idea of getting food at every meal was alien to them. At Windermere, they would sit at long benches for their meals, and a basket of bread rolls would be passed from the top down to the bottom. But there was never enough for the children at the end, because basically the boys would take a roll and then they'd take another one to hide for later in their pocket or something. It took a while for the idea that they would be fed every day, never mind every meal, to sink in. And also to this day, Dad will always scoop any soup or food in a pan right from the bottom, and that's because in the camps, the watery soup they were fed, whatever small amount of vegetable was in it, would always be at the bottom of the pan, and that's just a habit that stayed with him for life. World Jewish Relief, in my dad's view, was a wonderful charity. He says that they knew something of the horrors the boys had endured and that they'd lost all their families, but their aim, he felt, was to show them that life does go on, and slowly they started to rebuild their lives. I think it was so important that the boys always had each other for support. They were the only ones who really knew what they'd been through, and they were now each other's family. After they'd been at Windermere a while, the charity then started to break the boys up into smaller groups of about 30 or so and sent them to hostels all over the UK. Dad was sent to one in Loughton in Essex. And here's a photo. Oh, I missed one. Oh, okay, sorry, I had another photo before that and actually had Harry Balsam, who I mentioned about the turnip in the field, and Izzy, the guy with the diamond, but sorry, for some reason it's not on there now. Education and training carried on, and eventually they were split into smaller and smaller groups until maybe there were just 2 of them in a bedsit. And his dad changed his name to Harry. It was easier for people to understand, and he learned to trade. He eventually became a tailor like his father. So the deal with the charity was that when you were earning a certain wage, you were considered financially independent, although the charity was always there for the boys for help if anyone ever needed it. They also started a club called the Primrose Club in London, where the boys would still regularly meet up. Dad got an apprenticeship as a tailor and started work, but he felt that although he'd survived the war, he'd lost everything and everyone. He felt empty, and he didn't really know what the point of life was. Then a few years down the line, he met my mother, and after a whirlwind romance, married aged 27. They married on the 10th of March 1957 and had 3 children. I'm the youngest. Dad always used to say that it was one Friday night before I was born. Mum lit the Sabbath candles, and my 2 brothers were playing on the floor, and then it hit him. He finally understood what his mother had meant when she pushed him out the house aged 12, and he said to himself, "Mum, you were right about one of us surviving." He just hadn't understood it for a long time, and as he always says now, "Hitler, you didn't succeed. I'm here with a family of my own." Family is everything to my father, and here's a photo taken on their 50th wedding anniversary. Me and my 2 brothers, our partners, and all 9 of their grandchildren. Mum and Dad took a conscious decision to not let hate rule them or live in Dad's heart. Well, this must have been incredibly hard for him, but he always chooses love, life and laughter over bitterness. His greatest joy is the knowledge that his children don't live with hate and that we have passed this on to our children too, and so we can all live happy, normal lives. As he says, if you live with hate, the only person you're hurting is yourself. Now, this was meant to be a video of my dad telling you all that, but unfortunately that's not working at the moment. I grew up in a family where we learnt nothing was as bad as you first thought it was, not after what Dad had been through. That family and good health are the most important things in life, and to always try and be the best at what you're doing. In 2007, Mum and Dad took me and my 3 children back to Poland. We visited Dad's hometown and the synagogue I mentioned earlier, where he was held before being released back to work. We then drove to the forest where the other less fortunate ones had been taken and shot into mass graves, including the young man my dad witnessed making that split decision to stay with his young child. And the Polish government actually put up a memorial by the forest where this happened. So again, that was quite an emotional day, as my dad with his wife, child, 3 grandchildren, and it could so well have been him buried in the forest there behind us. We went to visit Treblinka and we said Kaddish, the Jewish memorial prayer for my father's family. And it was there that I realised it wasn't simply my father's mother, father and sister who was murdered, but it was my grandmother, my grandfather and my aunt. Have we got? And here's a photo of Treblinka, and again it kind of puts into perspective. Each rock here is not a person, it's not a family, it's not even a street. Each rock there represents a town or a city, so you can see sort of what numbers we're talking about. Dad has done 3 trips with all 3 of his children and 9 grandchildren. He always says it's important to show us where he was born and where these atrocities took place, so if we're confronted by people who say it never happened, we can say yes it did, and we saw where. As he always commented, in 1942, a group of high-commanding Nazi officers sat around a conference table to discuss the best and most efficient way to kill millions of people, including children, simply for the fact that they'd been born Jewish. Before the war, these men were ordinary and well-educated people, doctors, lawyers, they were family men. And Dad could never understand how these intelligent people could do that so calmly, devising ways to commit mass murder. Well, to mark the 70th anniversary of their liberation in 2015, the children and grandchildren of the boys created 4 memory quilts to commemorate our parents and grandchildren and keep their memory alive. The squares tell incredible stories of survival, success in creating new families and businesses, and contributing to British society, but above all, the love of the family that lives on. And that's actually, just recently they were taken on tour in Newcastle, so you can see how large they are. And the next one. And that's a picture again of my dad in Windermere. You can see the lake behind him, and that's the quilts that his square's on. And the next one. And this is my dad's square. It was made by his granddaughter, my niece. So basically, the top, let one of us survive, the last words spoken to him by his mother, names of his father, mother and sister, Polish flag, and you can see the English flag in the shape of a heart because that just symbolises how much Dad loves his adoptive country, and the names of all his children and grandchildren, and as they say, the story continues. Well, I'm so incredibly proud of my father. After all he went through, but still he managed to make a success of his life, both in business and personal, and he's always so happy, never hating anyone. His greatest pleasure is his family, his wonderful wife, my mother, his 3 children and 9 grandchildren. So this is a photo. It's not the best photo of my dad, I agree, but it's just one that always reminds me of just love of growing up. That smile on his face, the twinkle in his eyes, so it's always happy. So even after the horrors he endured, he still thinks of himself as a lucky man. He survived and he has a wonderful family. As he says, it's not where you start in life, it's where you finish. and I have finished very well with a wonderful and loving family. Now, I also had a clip for you because he was just recently asked to speak to Chelsea Football Club for their Say No to Anti-Semitism campaign, but that's not working either. But if you go online, you'll see my dad talking in that. So that's it. Thank you all for listening to me talk about my dad, Harry Spiro. And remember, you are all now witnesses to the Holocaust because I've shared my dad's life story with you. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
What type of business did your dad run?
He was a tailor, and then he had a couple of shops and a couple of factories. And I think the height of his business, he employed about 400 people across the UK. So he put back into society.
How long has he been in the UK since he came?
He came in 1945, so what's that? Long time.
Was it easy for your dad to actually talk about this experience?
Do you know, it always was. And I know some of them, as I said, we call them the boys. Some boys did find it difficult. With us, with my family, my father was always open about it. It was just always there from age appropriate. But I never ever remember a situation where it was like, sit down, we have something to tell you. He always spoke about it, was very open about it, if we were interested, and I was. So.
You know how you said that he doesn't hate anyone?
Mm-hmm.
Does he hate the people who done this to him and his family?
Well, he is asked that quite often when he talks to schools, and he's asked if he forgives. And as he's always said, he's never actually been asked for forgiveness. He doesn't hate Germans. And would they? I don't know if he'd forgive or not, but he certainly doesn't live with hatred in his life.
Does he regret, leaving his family?
He does. I mean, he doesn't regret leaving his family. I mean, it took a lot for his mother. I mean, she must have been a very strong woman to make him leave. He doesn't regret leaving them because it's what she wanted, and ultimately he survived. But at the time, it was very, very difficult for him, and he certainly didn't want to leave at the time.
See, when he was sleeping in the wooden bunk beds?
Yeah.
Did him and his friends play in that? Or it was just boring?
No, there was no playing. They were...
Was there Nazis eyeing them? What's it called? Watching them?
Yeah, they were guards all the time, and it was just work, and then they were too exhausted for anything.
If your pupils want to find out more information, what are some good places for them to start looking?
The Imperial War Museum, they've got a lot of video testimonies there. They've got a whole special room dedicated to the Holocaust.
There's a website called The Holocaust Explained, which is pitched around about this age, and that's a great place to start. There are testimonies there, timelines, all kinds of things. It's all laid out in a very organised way. It's all a long time ago. All of this. Why have you decided to tell the story?
Why have I decided?
What's in it for you? Why are you telling this story?
It's always been my promise to my father. As I said, my father never had any problems talking about his experiences, but it wasn't until he retired at the age of 80 that he took the time to go and talk to schools. And if you would have seen the video, that he's very aware that he feels education is the best way to ensure that something like this never happens again. And I've always promised him that I would carry on in his place instead.
Do you know the story called The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas?
Yes, I do.
Did your father know who it was? Or?
No, because that was in Auschwitz, and my father was never in Auschwitz.
Have you ever thought of actually publishing the memoirs of your father?
Not
because
really.
It was a really well put memory of your father.
Oh, thank you. The second generation, we're still quite new at all of this, and I know some of the boys, their children have published their parents' story, but it's nothing we've really to consider, but maybe in the future. Thank you.
The very first time that your father told you the story of his past and you really understood it, was it hard for you to take it in?
It wasn't really. I think, children just adapt, and, for instance, I only ever grew up with one set of grandparents. When I realised people had two sets of grandparents, for me that was very strange. So I think really children just adapt to what they are. And as I said, he always told us age appropriate, so it was never too horrific until we were old enough to understand.
Do you think that humanity has? Do you think humanity will ever go back to the horror of the Holocaust?
I hope not. I mean, you know, I know there have been other atrocities, but this, I'm not a history teacher, but it was so organised and around the whole world and so systematic that, of course, there are atrocities that happen, but they're more localised, and I would hate to think that anything like that could ever happen again on that scale.
Did his front teeth grow back?
Nope. He's got some dentures now when he came to England. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, but any of the photos when he was a young man, he would never smile with his mouth because he was very conscious of missing his front teeth.
How do you feel that your dad was one of the lucky ones to survive out of 6 million Jews?
Lucky. He's a special man. I wish he maybe one day, I don't know, he was a very special man and just very lucky.
How did your children feel about this story when he or you told him this?
Well, again, we just always told it in an age-appropriate way. There wasn't any one moment that it was like a revelation to them. It was just always something that was around, but not in a depressing way.
We've got this candle here. I'm going to ask Tracy to light it, and you want people to stand up for a minute and quiet just to reflect on the morning proceedings. Thank you.